Welcome all to All Killer, No Filler, the writing discussion podcast.
Classic.
Welcome all to All Killer, No Filler, the writing discussion podcast created and hosted by Rowan University's own Avant literary magazine. I'm your host, Adam Buckley, and today I'm joined by my fellow assistant editor and co-host,
Stephen Flickinger.
Before we get into this episode's discussion topic, which is all about dialogue, we want to introduce the podcast broadly. And firstly, we're both e-board members of Avant Literary Magazine, Rowan's undergraduate lit mag. This podcast is an extension of the club and of the magazine. If anyone listens to this thing, we can go on to have other e-board members, our boss, editor-in-chief, Kelsey Pedersen, and among others, to come on and host. And finally, All Killer, No Filler is primarily discussion-based, meaning that this is not writing advice.
Not in the slightest.
We're not professionals. The hope for this podcast is that, any would-be listeners could benefit from us yapping. They might, glean something from our processes or our discussions. But, we're just... Our jobs is we sit around, we look pretty, and we write emails. For the club. During meetings, we talk, but we are not professionals. This is not writing advice, and we're just here to have fun.
Exactly.
So, without further ado, I think we should just get right into it because to set the tone of this, this is primarily discussion based. And the first order of business is we're going to talk about dialogue because,
Heavy topic. Heavy topic when it comes to writing.
For me.
Yeah.
Because, if you've attended an Avant meeting, if we get a short story, which, please send in more short stories. For me personally, because I like to read them.
We love short stories.
Because we get plenty of poetry. I don't want to say too much poetry.
No such thing. No such thing as too much poetry.
For you? No, I'm just kidding. I like poetry, but, I'm not much...
You've grown on poetry.
Yes. Learning about poetry, becoming a poet myself. Poet with, a undercase, lowercase p.
Little asterisks.
Yeah, you can't really... I wouldn't call myself a poet. I have done poetry, but, writing poetry does not a poet make, I don't think. I think it's got to be... There's just something more.
More of a mindset.
Really. More of a grind set, really, yeah. I think short stories in particular, they're very hard. I think right now I'm kind of, a sneak peek into the sick, twisted mind of Adam Buckley. Yeah. I'm working on a short story right now, and it's it's tough, man, to get all you need to do in under X amount of words.
It is hard, yeah, because there's so much you have to establish in such a short time. And that's why dialogue in a short story is really important because it can help you deliver some of that exposition.
Exactly. And that's a point of order I want to get into later. We have notes.
Yeah.
I do. I have them written down.
A couple.
And because I'm a bit of a stickler.
Yeah.
I know you told me a funny story where you were just reading something out in the wild, I think, right? Just going about your business and reading dialogue as you do. And you just told me that in the back of your mind, you're like, Adam would hate this.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's also something that comes up when I'm watching a movie. Particularly, I think the story you're thinking of is when I was watching Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania.
Oh,
and
a movie I've not seen.
Yeah, a movie Adam hasn't seen, but I saw it in theaters, and the dialogue in that movie, if you've seen it, is just it's something else. And I knew that Adam would have he might have fainted if he had watched the movie.
I'm not that sensitive. I feel like with me specifically, we're talking about prose dialogue. I think when you get into more visual mediums, when you get into film or TV or comic books or something, there's more elements you have to grapple with. There's actors who are delivering that in their own way. Sometimes a line can be kind of not good.
Yeah.
But an actor,
it's all about the performance.
Yeah. It's when you're writing dialogue, you don't have any of that assistance. It just kind of has to be
Yeah.
the only person you're really bouncing off of is the audience member. So like you have to just trust them.
Yeah.
And like, you know, we read, I mean, just in our experiences, like we know it's hard to do that. And like there are plenty of writers who, you know, it's hard to trust the audience to get what you're saying, because that's like that's everyone's worst fear, is that they're misinterpreted, or that, you know, they
For
write
sure.
something they think is like, oh yeah, it's like, you know, their quill is on fire, you know,
Yeah.
they're ready. You're like, yeah, dude. And then someone receives it just entirely. Like you think you're like writing something badass, and then the other one's like, this is cringe. You know what I mean? Like that's like the
Exactly.
worst. So, you know, I think that's like the fear, and I think that gets into writers' heads. You know, it makes you make, I think, I don't want to call them amateur mistakes because that's harsh, but
Yeah.
I think it's, you know, we are amateurs, we're not professionals.
Absolutely.
So I don't think it's too, amateur just has such a charged.
Yeah, there's definitely a connotation behind the word amateur, but it's not a bad thing to
No.
be an amateur.
Most of us are.
Yeah, I mean, like, very few people become, like, professionals at something, so to be an
Right.
amateur, I mean, no reason to look down on yourself for it.
Yeah, and it's like to call someone else an amateur, parentheses derogatory,
Yeah.
like when you're a college student, is like,
Yeah.
you're not a professional either.
Exactly.
Like, I don't know. But to really get into it, what do you consider, Steven, like good dialogue?
That is a great question.
Loaded, one might say.
Yeah. I think it also really depends on the genre
Mhm.
of the work, because something I discovered recently in a class I'm taking called Writing Children's Stories is that, like, writing dialogue for something like that is
Mhm.
a lot different than writing
Oh,
dialogue
I'm
for
sure.
like an adult audience, because you have to make things like more simpler to communicate to certain audiences. So really good dialogue, it's hard to nail down because it's really dependent on the subject matter of what you're writing.
Mhm.
But to put it under an umbrella, I would say it's just anything that when you read it, it doesn't really like give you the like Metal Gear Solid like like, oh, I noticed something, like,
Yeah.
it's something that just doesn't trigger that sense, I
Mhm.
guess.
Yeah, you know, like most things in my life, before I do anything, I ask my mom about it. And my mom reads a lot. She just recently got like a new Kindle Fire machine, and I use it primarily to read comic books. But
Yeah.
you know, she got a new one because the old one up and died, and you know, she reads all the time. Primarily, like, you know, she calls them chick lit books. That's the term she uses. I'm not a, you know, industry insider. I don't know some of these terms, but or like, you know, rom-com stuff. And
Yeah,
she
like
was like,
romance.
yeah, so you know, she reads a lot. And you know, so I asked her about it. I was like, you read? And you're a reader, you read. And she said that dialogue in those books, I mean, like, that's very important because it's mostly character. It's like a softer kind of genre. It's not, I can't imagine there's too much plot. So I think it has to rely on these characters and their relationships and what they're saying to one another.
Exactly. Romance definitely has to rely on dialogue more than probably most genres, because getting the audience invested in the romance is almost entirely dependent on what the characters are saying to each other.
Yeah.
Like, if the audience would be like, oh, what he just said there was kind of creepy, like, I don't like
low-key.
that.
Yeah.
Like, they're not going to be on board for the
Right.
romance, which is the entire point.
It's interesting because, you know, that's like a whole other discussion, is like how we view that in a modern lens of like, okay, dialogue and what we find acceptable now in, you know, the year of our Lord 2024. It's like, well, that's very different than, you know, 100 years ago or whatever. And like, to me, good dialogue is like, I have a bulleted list. I have a bit of a theory, like, you know, the Buckley unified theory of good dialogue is like 3 key points. The first 2 are a little more important than the third.
Okay.
But the first point to me is it has to characterize the speaker. Like, you get what I'm saying?
That makes sense, yeah.
Like,
I get what you mean.
It feels kind of like no shit. Should we swear?
I mean, that's, yeah.
I can censor myself out in post. My mom might listen to this. I don't know. But like, it's kind of a given, it feels. But I feel like it's when you don't recenter yourself. There's plenty of times, I don't know if this is your experience, but if I'm working on something bigger, like it's not a short story, where I think a short story, every line counts. You got to be, you know. But like if you're working on a longer piece like a novel, you can be a little more loosey-goosey about it. And you can just have characters, shoot the breeze and it's fine because that is characterizing. It serves a purpose. But like you can kind of go into autopilot mode, right?
Yeah.
Where you're just writing stuff because you're like, well, it's kind of like your brain is like doing like what AI generation does. Where it's like you're sampling all of the human interactions you've ever had before, and you're kind of synthesizing them into like the perfect play-by-play.
Right.
But I do that all the time. Not AI generation, but like I do like the autopilot thing. It happens to me frequently. I just gotta like just erase what I wrote because it's like bad. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
When you go into autopilot, you're just kind of filling in blanks in that way. But it's like that's not what dialogue's purpose is, at least to me, in like a more poetic or like romantic kind of way, where it's like that's not the point of dialogue. That's not what it should be. Like dialogue should. I think it's a choice. You're making a choice to have these characters say this thing that should matter.
Yeah.
And like when I mean it characterizes the speaker, I think it should characterize that person in that moment, but also like who they are overall.
Yeah, it should be clear. You should be able to ask yourself, would this character say this?
Yeah.
And the answer should always be yes, obviously.
Yeah.
Or else you're in pretty hot water there.
And like, yeah, it's like one, you're kind of strayed from God's light.
Yeah.
Like you're not on the right path there. But also like sometimes you can lose grasp of your characters, which is fine. When it's all in your head, it's a lot to keep track of. Like it's fine if you're kind of like, when you do go into autopilot, and it's better to realize it because when you go back, you're like, these characters would not say this. And like, that's like the worst kind of sin because it's boring also. Like when your characters are just kind of saying stuff to say stuff, it's kind of like, well, why are they doing this? What does it matter? But also, like, I think it should cover that person's state of mind in the moment because characters will say things that they don't mean because humans do that.
Yeah, everybody
like,
does that.
Yeah, characters will act out and you might think to yourself, well, that's like that's like a shitty thing to do. Or that character might be like, that's a bad guy. But it's like, well, if that character is a bad guy, like, or if a character lies or whatever, like, people might cry that's out of character, but like, as a writer, your job is to like determine where that is.
Yeah. It's not really up to the audience to really determine what would be in character for
at least,
character.
Yeah, when you're in the draft
to a certain extent, yeah.
Yeah, like you shouldn't, I don't know, this is a tough sort of line to ride when like you should think about like what people on the other end are going to think.
Absolutely.
But you shouldn't let that determine your choices too much.
No.
Like it's fine to anticipate criticism, but I don't think it's good to let that affect your decision making too much. Like, I don't know. It's for this specific point, like about characterizing the character, I think it's definitely about current state of mind, but like the overall character, like I think especially when you're first meeting a character, that dialogue is very particular. I feel like you should be particular about who that character is and why they would say. It's like in video games when they have to tutorialize things. Like, don't make like your grumpy like coworker friend be the guy who's like, oh, I got to teach him how to do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
Like that would be ill-fitting for that character because if a character is like sort of taciturn and grumpy, why would they take the time out of their day to like teach a character how to do something they probably already know? Like, exactly. But like that's the thing with the exposition point you brought up, where it's like that's poorly integrated exposition, where it's like it wouldn't make sense for this character to say this thing, but as a writer, I need that to happen for my purposes, and that's when you get
push
that
the story forward.
Yeah. So I think chiefly, I dropped my pen. Chiefly, point one is about characterizing the character. I think when you hear the line, you should go. I think the whole like, would that character say that? That's definitely like a point I want to bring up, but like you should definitely think to yourself, at least I know something more about that character now.
Right.
It doesn't have to be intentionally like revealing, like, oh, he just bore his soul. Like, and we know his whole backstory. He just gave us his tragic backstory.
Just give you like a little insight, just a tiny bit. Like, okay, I now know this about this character.
Right. And I think from a writing perspective, at least when I'm in that position, I go like, okay, here's what I would say. If I'm in this situation, if Adam Buckley personally, if I'm in this situation, here's what I would say. But then you have to filter that through who your character is. If, take for example, I'm an amazing man, as I know I am. Like if I'm just a great guy, imagine I'm like the perfect guy who always knows what to say in any given situation, Well, I can't write a character who's like a bit of like a smart ass, like a bit of like a snide kind of, person. If that's like that character's dominant personality traits, I can't make that character then like, put a hand on that character's shoulder. It'll be okay, buddy. You know what I mean? Unless you can do that, unless it's like a surprise, like, oh wow, that snarky, smart ass guy
has a softer side.
Yeah, Han Solo, he's a rogue with a heart of gold. Like, unless you want to do that, but like you have to think to yourself, truly, this is a make or break moment for a character. What you decide them to say and do is like super important. But moving on from my first point, I think the second point is not just like, would that character say that? It has to be only that person could say it that way. I think this is where we're getting a little. You're like looking at me in a way.
Now I'm gonna need you to explain this one a little bit more deeply for me to understand. I think.
So I think this is when we're getting into like, I guess, more technique stuff, where it's like, I think it's fun when characters have notable speech patterns or catchphrases or something like that, where it's like, then like out of context. This is the test. If out of context you were to take this line and just, theoretically, this is a 2-person test because like
2-person exercise.
Yeah, one person would have to have read your work, and then you would have to present them a line in isolation, and you could be like, out of these characters in my story, the important ones, who said this? And if they can do it, because you've written it so well, you've tailored that line of dialogue so well to that person's personality, they should be able to do it. Now, that does rely on the person paying attention. But yeah. And I think this method, at least when you keep this in mind, that like, and it's very similar to point 1, but like the idea that only one character could say it like that, it keeps you from, or it avoids writing more cliche kind of stock dialogue, which is, I hate that. I hate like, and cliche, it's like, I know that's like a no word we don't like to say at least in the Avant meetings.
Yeah.
It's kind of meaningless at this point.
Yeah, cliche.
The word, I mean.
Yeah, it's so hard to like define, I guess, because I don't know, things become cliche obviously because they work, I guess.
Like a trope or something. Yeah. And that reminds me when I was talking to my mother before I came to record this, like, it brought to mind like a thought I had when you're working with a plot that's like really tropey or really cliche, it's almost like you're working with someone else's tools. Like they're like hand-me-downs. They're like bad. You know what I mean? It's a hammer, but it's dull and it doesn't work. Or like, it's a screwdriver that's been ground down. It doesn't even work anymore. Like it's bad. And you can only get so far. You can't actually build whatever you want to build. You can't build your story around hand-me-down tools that don't work anymore. And it's like, or at the very least, they'll only get you so far.
Yeah.
So like if you're relying on stock dialogue and trope dialogue, and sometimes it can be fun, when you throw out I love one of these, this cannot be. Yeah. Like I love one of them.
That's a classic.
That's a goated classic. Like this cannot be. I also love you're not gonna shoot me. Bam! That's great.
You're not gonna shoot me and then get shot is
that's amazing.
It's one of my favorite tropes, actually.
See, this is the immediate counterpoint to point 2 is like, well, sometimes it's really fun.
Yeah.
What if we did a silly one? It's kind of the vibe. But I think point 1 kind of covers the why someone is saying it. When it characterizes the character, you don't have to think why they said it because it fits just like a glove. You understand their background and their character traits. So like, it's not that big a deal. Like, if someone, even if they say something, you're like, that's weird. But when you think about it, you go, yeah, but they'd say it. But then I think the second point kind of covers the how of like, well, how they're saying it is indicative of who they are. And like, if you can notice that in isolation, then like you're cooking, like it's good dialogue. And then point 3 is like, in comparison to the other points, is a little less thought out. I just wrote down, quote, passes vibe check.
Okay. So that's kind of like what I was saying earlier. Like the Metal Gear Solid sound effect. When
you read it, you think to yourself, real human people could say this. Yeah. And I think the bar is low. But I do think generally it is a vibes-based metric that we're working with, at least for point 3, where, my second like little bullet point under that is like generally realistic. And then in quotes, like it's a non-immersion breaker. Like, everything is, like what does Professor Kopp say? We're dancing while the music is playing.
Oh yeah.
I think that's kind of an apt analogy where it's like it's you're doing it, nothing's wrong. You're keeping up. It's not spectacular, but you are doing the right thing as a writer. Like you're keeping the pace, and you're nothing is breaking down. And I think that's good. But it's kind of like the bare min. Like you're not doing anything amazing, but crucially, you're not fumbling.
Yeah.
So
and half of writing is not fumbling. Really.
Exactly.
So,
yeah, it's just like constructing something so it's like sound.
If you write a book, not every page is going to be thrilling.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Some pages are just going to be a page.
Exactly. Like sometimes, that is kind of like another, like the real advice when it comes to like writing is like sometimes you just got to do what you got to do. Like, sometimes you got to write a million drafts. Sometimes you got to write, you just got to plan it out. You got to plot it. You got to get in the trenches with something. And like, that's kind of what happens with dialogue. Like sometimes you just got to work on it. You got to tweak it. You got to figure it out because like sometimes the circumstance doesn't really allow you to be, as truthful to, these three accords as I'd like to be. But, and I think the other point I have under point 3 is just like, it's memorable after the fact. Sometimes dialogue, the simple stuff you don't really think about could be the most impactful.
Yeah.
Like small lines. The small stuff can like stick in your brain, sometimes even better than the big stuff. Like I think here's a line of dialogue I love, and I think about it all the time. From Kingdom Hearts 1, when it's like in the beginning of the game, or maybe I don't remember actually when it is, but I just remember when Billy Zane in like one of his few, I don't know if he's done voice acting at any point after Kingdom Hearts 1, but his it's so well delivered. He goes, "Those who know nothing understand nothing." Like it's just like, like it's chilling. Like even if it wasn't delivered so well, the line "Those who know nothing can understand nothing" is like, I think it fits all three things.
Yeah, to your point, if we pulled that line out and you said, guess which Kingdom Hearts character
You could do
said
it?
this, I would probably guess Ansem.
Yeah, because it speaks to like, okay, let's, this is a great example. Okay, we can break it down point by point because like characterizes the speaker. We know, sorry, non-Kingdom Hearts fans in the audience, but you're going to learn today. Ansem is a scientist. He's like a mad scientist. And at this point, he lacks a body, but he is like a floating spirit. And he's even scarier in that state. But like
honestly,
he's wearing a little brown, like burlap sack looking little spirit. And it characterizes the character. We don't know Ansem by this point, but in retrospect, what do we know about Ansem? He's like a mad scientist type. Like he will go to really strange places and awful lengths to acquire knowledge. So the idea that he's looking down upon someone saying like, you know nothing so you can understand nothing, because his priority is knowledge. So that makes sense. And then number 2, only that person could have said it. There's no other character in the series that is that, like, I guess he speaks in that kind of hyperbole.
Particularly in that first game, especially.
As well, yeah. Like, when the cast is like, well, someone might think later there are more bad guys, more characters. Yeah. And especially, since every character in that series is also the same guy, like, you might go, well, that could be one version of this character or another. Like, if you were to just play the first game, no other character talks like this.
Yeah.
And like, I think that speaks to how like great of a line of dialogue it is. It's stuck with me ever since I played it.
Yeah.
So like and it's so chilling as well. The idea of it is just so scary. But I feel like only Ansem could have said it.
That's true. And I do think that test, I think it works a lot of the times, but I don't think it's necessarily a fair test.
It is very tough
for every single line of dialogue.
Right.
Because sometimes a character just is going to say something because it needs to be delivered to the audience. Or
like characters are in danger and they're like yelling to one another, or they're like, character A, character B is doing X and Y. Like, like that's not always going to be like that. I think there are definitely outliers or mulligans to the the Adam Buckley unified theory of good dialogue.
Yeah.
There's definitely exceptions. Just like anything in writing, there are exceptions. Good ones, too.
Yeah.
So, and even 3, it passes the vibe check. I do think it's a little dramatic.
Definitely dramatic, but it's a dramatic character.
Exactly.
And it's a dramatic game.
And it's definitely memorable after the fact.
Yeah. I mean, you remembered it.
Yeah, I remembered it. And it's like the one, when you're like in talking mode, when you're like talking with another person, never mind it being recorded, you kind of like, you can only really access like surface level information. That was like the first one I came to. It's like those who know nothing can understand nothing. That's crazy. And it's also like, that might be like a Metal Gear situation where you're like, huh? Like what? What does that mean? But at the very least, it gets you thinking. There's like a texture to the sentence where you're like, huh, this is a funky thing.
It sounds like something a villain would say, too.
Yeah. It's so menacing as a line. And it's like, with point 1, it's like he's talking down to you. Like you could say, he's talking down to the characters in the scene. But he's also kind of talking down to you as an audience member because like you know nothing about this game. It's the first one. Like you just started out. And he's calling you like like he's calling you like a punk. Yeah, he's calling you a stupid punk who doesn't know anything, and that he's like the bad guy and he's gonna kick your ass at the end of the game. Like I don't know. That's like when it comes to villains, like Ansem is a scary guy. Like
definitely.
Even like that's a game meant for children. Kingdom Hearts 1, it's got Disney characters in it, but also like it's scary. Like Ansem is a scary villain who says scary stuff.
Yeah.
So I think it definitely passes. The vibe check one, like asterisk. I think it passes the. We might add a third point under the third point. I think it's definitely contextual. You kind of have to contour the dialogue to like the world it's in.
Point number 2 is about how it would look out of context, but for point number 3, it has to be in context because you have to be inside the vibe of the piece for it to be able to pass the vibe check.
Lord of the Rings, for example, if they just started using like normal English, you know what I mean? Like 21st century, like, if Aragorn is, talking about, I don't know, normal pedestrian stuff, that'd be weird. That doesn't pass the vibe check because it's almost too normal. But if the normal of the series is like, something like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure or like something weird and wacky where like it's almost like people talking normal is the immersion breaker.
Exactly.
So you got to just contour it to the contextual elements of the story.
Yeah, writing good dialogue is more about writing good dialogue for that particular project. It has to be good dialogue for this universe that we're in.
Yeah, because if you're playing Kingdom Hearts and then Sora just starts like swearing, if you're watching anything with a child's media in it, and then you hear like a swear, you're like, whoa, you know what I mean? Even like just like a hell, you know what I mean? Yeah. Even like a normal or a damn, you're like, whoa, wait, like it's odd, and it's almost because it's too normal. When you're in like a heightened version of a story, like a JoJo's or a Kingdom Hearts or
something
anything
crazy,
Metal Gear, like something crazy where characters are talking not normal, like. When characters do talk normal, you're like, okay, this is odd, and it makes me uncomfortable. Those are my 3 core points on the good dialogue. When it comes to bad dialogue, it's just kind of the opposite of the 3 points, I think. Yeah. It's just kind of the opposite. Like, specifically, I think when dialogue is stock or cliche.
That's probably the big one, yeah.
I think when it's unabashedly utilitarian, it, like, really gets under my skin. Because I think there's so much to be gained by paying attention to the way characters talk and the way that they deliver their lines, that like outright ignoring it, I think is just like a disservice.
That's fair. But sometimes I feel that that's necessary in a story, especially
sometimes
in a short story, especially where like you have a limited number. Like let's say someone was writing something to submit to Avant. They have a 2,000 word limit.
Yeah. And even then that feels like a lot when you're reading it.
Yeah. But like maybe a character needs to say something completely utilitarian in order to just get that point forward. But there is a way, like as a writer, to say like, how would this character deliver this information? Like, and just flavor it that way.
If they have to say it.
Yeah.
You're like, okay, I only have 2,000 words and I'm like up to my neck in context that I need to deliver. There are definitely ways around it, but like if you're like, okay, I have to have this character say X, Y, and Z to another character. Yeah, like what you're saying is like if when you contour that to like who this person is, then it's definitely like it comes off better. I'm still, there will be people like me who will be, unpleasable. We're like, well, actually, it's still barely disguised exposition. Like, yeah, there's still going to be people like me who are going to take up an issue with it, but I can at least, appreciate that they tried. Yeah. Where it's like, when you only have so much space, you have to make concessions, not just as a writer, but like as an audience member, where you're like, well, it's just the way it is. So, I think another thing about my version of bad dialogue is like I think it can be distracting and unrealistic. Bad dialogue can be where it's like overwrought and kind of overwritten. Like
I see what you mean.
Characters going on like monologues or whatever. It's different when like we were talking about like when it's in a heightened version of reality,
a very dramatic like story or something.
Yeah, then that's fine. But like when it's trying to be normal, when it's like normal life, and like people talk about like Aaron Sorkin dialogue and like things like The West Wing, like the walk and talk, like
right.
We have characters need to go from A to B, perfect excuse to get some exposition out. You know what I mean? Like that I think is efficient. But like I think this is another point that I see kind of brought up is like characters are not real people. They don't need to talk like real people.
That's fair. But to a certain extent, it's fair.
They need to speak up.
Yeah, if you want to portray a story as if it takes place in the real world, then the characters do kind of have to talk like
that's the thing. When it's like it's different when it's a comedy or something.
Yeah.
Where like you can stretch reality.
That's one of the notes I wrote down was just dialogue and comedy because it's so different than normal dialogue. It's like almost entering a whole different sphere.
When I'm like, if I watch Superbad or something, or like 21 Jump Street, or like notable comedies, I'm not going to be like, this is entirely unrealistic. You know what I mean? Like, why?
You're not worrying about that.
Yeah, I'm stupid if I say that. Like, you know what I mean? If I complain about a comedy being stupid, I'm the idiot.
Exactly.
So, yeah, there's definitely exceptions to all this, and I think poorly integrated exposition can be like we just talked about how the fact that you do need to do it sometimes, which is fine. But I think when it's like bad, you know what I mean? When it's like, I guess when it's just like, okay, we really had to buckle down and do it, but it's like entirely unenthused with the idea of trying to disguise it in any way.
It's like when a character in the story just becomes a narrator to say,
or an exposition machine, or and when it comes to different mediums, it's different. Like in a video game, it's a little different, or like in a D&D campaign, or stuff like that, where you're kind of you are accustomed to the idea of a mentor type figure just straight up telling you how to play the game, which is fine because that's like a concession of the medium. But is in like a prose novel volume type situation, it's kind of like it's weird and disconcerting where you're like, if you're not at a school or if you're not at some kind of training situation where characters are just straight up telling other characters like what is happening in the world or stuff like that, it's like, okay, that's not great. Another point I have is just like it's not indicative of the speaker. When words come out of characters' mouths, you're like that they would never say that.
Yeah.
Sorry, you got to go back to the drawing board on that one.
That should always be the first question you ask when you're proofreading your own dialogue. Yeah,
it's like, would this character say this? And if they would they say it like this? That's like point 1 and 2. Like that's during the screening editing process. If you kind of look through the lens of point 1 and 2, 3 asterisk. But like point 1 and 2, that kind of keeps you right on it keeps you within the characterization of the characters you've made. And then my last point is just like when it's poorly disguised rhetoric by the author, when it's like self-insert stuff. That's rough.
Yeah, definitely.
And, I don't like to use that term self-insert. I feel like it's kind of like Mary Sue, or these points that the internet has just kind of destroyed. Where when people complain about self-inserts, it's kind of like, well, every character is kind of a self-insert to a degree.
Yeah.
So kind of complaining about that is
it's one of those things that's just been like beaten to death.
Yeah. and I don't think there's that much value in talking about it too much. I think when it's clear that the author wants to make a point, but they can't quite wrap the circumstances around what they want to say, so they kind of just have a character talk when it comes to like their theme, or it could be, you know, a political thing, or it can be like, you know, just what the story just is about. You know, like sometimes it can be done cleverly, you know, like bring it back to Kingdom Hearts, like my friends are my power. Like that line delivered, it's at a critical moment. Like that's like a good version.
It's the climax of the game, pretty much.
Yeah, I would, the emotional one at least, is you go on to fight the bad guy, but you don't really know that guy. So like it's just like that's like just like the plot naturally resolving itself. But when Sora says my friends are my power, at that moment, that's the emotional climax of the game. That's been set up. Yeah. But like imagine if it wasn't done nearly as well, and you never really liked any of the characters Sora met. You don't even like Donald and Goofy. Whoever doesn't like Donald and Goofy, I don't know what's wrong with them, but, you know, point is...
in that game, Donald is kind of... he's kind of mean.
True, but, like, I mean in general. Like, if you don't have some kind of warm... It's not. It's, like, not like
they're
Superman.
Like two of the most lovable characters ever made.
In fictional history,
They're Donald Duck and Goofy Goof. Like...
Yeah, like, I think it's kind of like not liking Superman. It's like, what's wrong with you? Like, it's one of those things where, like, you know, imagine if you didn't care that much, but the story up until that point, it made you care. And, you know, it could have been in subtle ways or in cryptic ways, but, like, when that moment happens, you're like, hell yeah, like, my friends are my power. When you get, like, the friendship is magic kind of, like, theme to your story, which, like, most kind of, there's certain kinds of...
A lot of, like, coming-of-age stories, like, that.
I think, you know, some do it better than others, but when characters literally say, like, well, without you, I couldn't have done X, Y, and Z. That's why you're my friend. Yeah. You know, it's kind of like, well, you know, I can handle some cheese. I like Kingdom Hearts, and I like Superman, and I like all these things that are cheesy and not subtle. I love Barbie. Like, you know what I mean? Like, subtlety, I like it, but it is not required. So, like, I agree with that. Yeah. So, it just, I think it has to be, what we're talking about isn't necessarily subtlety. It's, like, contextualization.
Yeah, because Kingdom Hearts isn't subtle.
No.
Like, in the slightest, but, like, in the context of that world, like hearing like Sora say, my friends are my power, isn't cheesy for Kingdom Hearts.
No, that's like about...
It's just par for the course for Kingdom Hearts.
Exactly. So when it comes to that kind of stuff, it is really about like a case-by-case basis. I mean, you could say that about everything we brought up. About dialogue, it is definitely case-by-case. And like, and it's medium by medium.
Exactly.
What I've been thinking about recently with like, I mean, this will like carbon date the podcast, but like Madam Web just came out. Madam Web, a movie I will not see, a movie I have not
see it either,
a movie I have not really been paying attention to. Anytime I learn about it, it's without my consent. You know, like on Twitter, online, on, you know, movie reviews and my YouTube recommended. But like, point is, I think it's just awakened me to like, you know, some other criticism I've had of like, I'm a big superhero fan, I'm a big comic book fan, and like I think the difference between like MCU Marvel film expectations are vastly different than like comic book expectations. Like when there's some reason why like people think like, you know, and like you go on Twitter and no one can agree about anything, but specifically this.
Yeah.
But like with like a costume, right? Like Iron Man in that first movie looks awesome.
Absolutely.
Like he looks really cool, but he also doesn't look like Iron Man from the comics, really.
I wouldn't know, but I'll take your word.
I mean, like 60s Iron Man.
Oh,
like when Iron Man first came out, where he has like metal underwear or whatever. Like he's wearing trunks, but like they're metal. I don't get it. Yeah. But like
when Iron Man was a loser. Pretty much.
Before, like, you know, Robert Downey Jr. made him cool.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, this is a bit of a tangent, but it's a roundabout way of saying, like, in a movie, people will scrutinize a superhero's costume for being, quote, not realistic. But in a comic book, Spider-Man can run around in basically his undies. Like, there's no padding. Like, you know what I mean?
That's, like, the thing that every, like, villain or whatever says when they're talking about Spider-Man, like, some guy like running around in his underwear, like that's something J. Jonah Jameson would say.
Exactly. So I think the way this relates to dialogue is like, I'm scrutinizing dialogue more in a novel because there's like less noise
It's
between
all you got. Right?
Exactly. There's less noise between me and the dialogue than there is in a movie or a comic book. So like in a movie, there's more to pay attention to, the cinematography, just the
line delivery.
Yeah, and like just like the visual act of me being in a space where I have to visually, interpret this information.
Yeah.
Whereas in a book, I can only interpret the specific details the author has chosen to give me. So like I have a little more agency in a film watching experience or in a comic book reading experience. So I don't know. That's how my stupid tangent kind of like comes back around into the dialogue situation where like, and people will scrutinize comic book dialogue a little more. Like I remember there was an X-Men comic, I think it was called X-Terminators. It was like explicitly like a Grindhouse comic book, like a Grindhouse comedy. It had like an age rating on it and everything. I haven't seen a comic book with an age rating, at least anything that I've read in a long time, like really ever.
Yeah.
But like it's like a raunchy kind of Grindhouse comedy, and like people did not like it. I mean, well, people who read it liked it. People who did not read it didn't like it.
Just unhappy with the idea of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's like stuff like that where I'm like, okay, the dialogue, yeah, it's like what you're talking about with comedy. Like it's super, gross out and it's super extreme, but it's also like a comedy.
Yeah.
It's contouring to the contextual genre that it is. So I don't really get why we're all upset. Like, I mean, it's Twitter, so like people are always upset, but like, or it's X, but like,
It's Twitter.
Yeah. Like it's one of those things where you just gotta concede some things. Like there's an act of concession when you operate in certain genres, where it's like if you're less or more familiar, you're gonna feel certain ways about the way the characters are acting or the way that they're talking. So that's my list. And I've been yapping for a bit. So, Steven, do you have any other like points about dialogue, like anything else you wrote down that you think?
Well, one thing, I don't know, did you see the new Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem?
Oh,
that
yeah.
Came out like last summer?
It's awesome.
Yeah.
That's great, yeah.
I think it's one of the best examples of dialogue I've seen in any medium, book, movie, video game.
Yeah. Oh, he's mollywopping me. Oh, it's so good. Yeah.
It's just so funny, and it works so well for those characters. And it, like, back to your list, it characterizes them as like these young teens, which is something that we've never really seen for the Ninja Turtles. And
yeah,
I just thought that movie was phenomenal.
Oh yeah, that movie's great. You want to talk about like Chekhov's Attack on Titan, which is crazy.
Yeah.
Like I think that's one of those things what I think about all the time when it comes to like the vibe check of it all, like the third pillar of the theory is like there's plenty of dialogue that I guess you could say doesn't pass sort of the vibe check, because you just like sometimes, at least in my brain, when you've written so many things, or if you're just a student and you're studying, you kind of can't switch it off when you watch other stuff or read other stuff. So like it's almost like you're not interpreting the sentence, you're seeing through it into like its utilitarian purpose.
Yeah.
Where you're like, well, that character said that to set that thing up.
You're thinking about why the writer did that instead of the actual thing.
Yeah, and I think when your point about Mutant Mayhem, the TMNT movie, which I really like.
Yeah.
I saw that with my sister.
It was one of my favorite movies of the year last year.
Yeah, it was really good. And your point about dialogue is like it's really good that they got real teenagers to act those, and I'm sure they wrote those lines of dialogue as well.
Yeah.
I'm like, I haven't seen it it came out last summer of 2023, so I'm like having a tough time recalling some dialogue. I do love he's mollywopping me.
Yeah.
Like that's great. Like when I think it's Donnie who's like getting messed up by Superfly.
Yeah.
And he's just like, oh no, like he's commentating his own like ass whooping. Like it's crazy.
They're just throwing out like teen slang, just it added so
we
much.
Outside, it's so good.
Yeah, they're like Aki, just for like no reason.
Yeah, it's so good.
And it works too because they're like teenagers who also have just like lived underground in isolation their whole life.
it speaks to their circumstances, characters, where
Yeah.
like they would kind of go crazy on teen slang because they've been kind of deprived of it their whole lives.
Yeah, but they have like cell phones, so they just hear it on like TikTok.
They don't have that much
it's
human
just,
context.
Yeah, it's just become like their entire like dialect, which I think is so funny.
Yeah, and I think on the point of characterizing like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, that's a great sort of segue into that whole discussion because like they're, I think it's kind of like your favorite X-Men character is like your favorite Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles character where you can tell so much about a person.
That's
who they identify with. And like those characters are so unique. Like, they're kind of like the bedrock of like story almost. It's like, Leo's the leader.
It's like the classic team dynamic.
It's the 4-man band. I guess there's the other trip, like the 5-man band, like your D&D party type composition. But like, you want to talk about the 3 pillars rule. Leo and Raph are not going to talk the same. Their dialogue isn't going to reflect them the same way. And like, they're, even though they're mutants who live underground, their dialogue generally passes the vibe check. They say things like normal people would. So, things like Mikey and Donnie aren't going to speak the same. Even characters who are a little more close in personality, I guess you could say Leo and Donnie might be the closest.
Maybe, yeah.
Since they're both a little more straight-laced in that way.
Yeah.
You might be able to, the isolation test might not be able to help with that one, but like generally I think it's like those characters that they're brothers and all, and they overlap in some places, but like generally those characters, it's like they're shooting off in 4 different directions, and like generally you're going to be able to discern who is saying what between those 4 characters. Cyclops isn't going to say the same thing as Wolverine.
Oh, that never.
No, like, and I feel like with number 2, like Bub, the classic Wolverine catchphrase, or like snicked. You want to talk about onomatopoeia? I feel like that could be a whole discussion in and of itself. It's like, where does onomatopoeia kind of like associating certain like thwip for Spider-Man?
Oh, yeah.
Is that it's almost like dialogue. You know what I mean? It's like it's like his body is expressing dialogue. It's a trademark thing that is always with him, or like snicked. The sound that Wolverine's claws make when they come out of his hands. Like, and so, I've been rewatching the X-Men movies, all like 13 of them or however many.
All a million of them.
And I will say, those are some of the most quotable movies. Those movies have great dialogue. I'm serious. Like, I've seen those movies so many times that I rewatched X-Men 1 and 2. At this point, and like I can quote those movies. It's like Jurassic Park, where it's like these are movies with amazing dialogue.
Jurassic Park does have amazing dialogue. Spielberg usually always has great dialogue in his films.
Like Jurassic Park specifically is like a must go faster, or life finds a way, or droppings. You know what I mean? Like stuff like that, where it's like small stuff that's like totally inconsequential. Oh, Tim, the human piece of toast. Like I could just read you the script. Because I've seen this movie so many times, the dialogue is so good. And even something with X-Men, where it's like characters in X-Men, at least those movies, before they get bad, the first 2 at least have like really great dialogue, where it's like Ian McKellen is just killing it as Magneto. But it's also like, why do you ask questions to which you know the answer to? Magneto and Mystique are just being really catty. They're just like, oh, like they're just like, they're the worst. I love them. But like, Rogue has a little strip of white in her hair because of what Magneto did to her in the first movie. And Magneto's like, I love what you've done with your hair. You know what I mean?
So
it's like,
sassy.
I know. And it's like, that version of Magneto is so distinct from the comic book version of Magneto.
Yeah.
Where like Magneto is a pretty self-serious guy. He's not quipping.
No.
But like, at least in the comics, I mean, he's been known to make a joke or 2. But like in the movies, like he's a class act. He's the class clown. Like, Magneto is constantly like quipping and making jokes. And like, yeah, that's, a different characterization. But for that movie, for that version of him, it's like so palpable. It's so evocative.
It shows how dialogue is so important to characterization, because just the way he speaks completely changes this adaptation of the character from the original in the comics.
And like, you watch like the 90s X-Men cartoon where it's like everyone is like theatrically talking, they're like thespians. It's like Shakespearean, where they're constantly kind of projecting their deal at each other all the time. Whereas like in the X-Men movies, it's like it kind of has those movies in general kind of have like a too cool for school attitude where they're a little embarrassed about being X-Men movies and like being about superheroes, oh, what do you want? Like yellow spandex? You know what I mean? Like that line, there's a podcast called Yellow Spandex, I think. It's about X-Men. Like that line is so iconic.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, something we learned in the pre-production of this podcast is that there's a podcast named Everything.
Yeah, I guess a little behind the scenes. We wanted to call this podcast This Is Not Writing Advice, but we found one that's also called that.
Yeah.
Which, I was like really disappointed because this is not writing advice. like that feels like the vibe for this. But
that's
all
why
killer,
we wanted to make it clear that this is not writing advice.
Exactly. Yeah, we're just two people with opinions. But all killer no filler is just like a phrase we love.
Yeah.
I feel like that kind of characterizes us. I did like the idea of it's also just a thing we say in Avant all the time.
Yeah.
To when we really feel like something's really hitting the nail on the head, like no BS, like getting straight to the point, like all killer, no filler. Like it is streamlined, effective, like that kind of thing. But also like I do love, we appreciate brevity here. I do love that as well. I mean, you can't really call a podcast We Appreciate Brevity.
No.
Especially when they're...
We've just been yapping.
Exactly. So, like that kind of thing where this principle of dialogue, it can also extend to like just anything a character does ever. I think extensively about what a character is doing and how it reflects them all the time before they make a move. I'm like, well, does this really reflect who they are? Because I think when you fall back on that kind of autopilot, like that, like it's arbitrary. It doesn't really mean anything. I just need the character to do this.
Yeah.
It kind of lacks that punch where it's like, well, if everything comes together, theoretically, the audience should never ask why
are you doing this?
Yeah, they should never really have a question. And that's also
that might be impossible, but
yes.
But it would be like the ideal.
It's the
unattainable ideal to strive for.
The perfection. The goal at the end of the mountaintop that never really quite ends. But dialogue is a tricky thing, and I think it's really comes down to context, character, and just your goal. I think something that has crazy dialogue like Metal Gear. Does Metal Gear stack up when it comes to good dialogue? If you were to think about it critically, no BS. Like no, if you took away your personal feelings about Metal Gear. I don't really have that many. No. I've never played a Metal Gear. I've played the funny one, Rising Revengeance. I played that one.
What a title.
I know. That also, you want to talk about dialogue in that game, they use the word meme, like by its dictionary textbook definition.
What is the
dictionary definition? I believe a meme is like an idea you've inherited, like a perpetuating kind of.
Which I did not know that.
Like an idea that spreads, I think, is kind of like, that's why we call like online gags memes, because we're sharing them, we're spreading them, you're kind of inheriting them through other, like a line will be like memes. Literally, this is a line, I swear to God, this is a line from Metal Gear Rising Revengeance, okay? Memes, period. The DNA of the soul.
Oh my God.
So like, and, okay, let's take memes, period, the DNA of the soul, and let's go down the three. Does it characterize the character speaking? Well, the character in that, in that moment, they do care about memes. That is something that they, care about. So that speaks to their character. Only that person could have said it. I believe so. I know you don't have context for this.
Yeah,
but
I definitely wouldn't say it. That's all I can say about it.
Right. I don't know if I would say memes the DNA of the soul. But when you think that character in that moment is kind of like testing the protagonist, like he's pushing that character to the limits, and that's like another kind of emotional climax of that game when Monsoon is talking to Raiden, and like Raiden is that's where that meme comes from. He's like, "Doctor, turn off my pain inhibitors," and like that's a crazy line also. Yeah. But like only Monsoon could have said memes the DNA of the soul, because he's kind of a memey character, like meme as in the internet gag kind of sense.
But that might be why it doesn't pass the vibe check, is because they use
That's
a
true.
word that has like this like connotation in like internet culture,
mm-hmm.
and they're using it by its like different meaning.
They're playing it totally straight.
But there's no way anybody could ever hear that and not think of our like modern understanding of what a meme is.
Yeah, because it's very funny.
It is really funny.
That is the thing. It's very funny. I don't know if that's the thing about the vibe check. It's going to be so person to person.
And it does depend on like where the dialogue is like taking place. Like the goal of the story or the goal of the dialogue is the most important thing, really, because it dictates how the person will talk. Like if the genre and the goal kind of go hand in hand, I feel like.
Yeah, you're gonna have to tailor these people's speech to like, or like the dialogue has to be pointed in some way. Like you have to have a reason. Are there any closing thoughts you like to rattle off? Any good lines of dialogue you can recall off the top of the dome?
Something I really like is lines of dialogue that kind of don't fit like where they come from, but that kind of like makes them cooler. Like, do you know like the famous like monologue from FNAF 6 Pizzeria Simulator?
No, and I need you to tell me right now.
Well, basically the person who founded the pizzeria with the evil guy.
I'm a little learned when it comes to.
Okay.
I've watched like half of the game theories.
Okay.
I've watched like 40 out of 86.
So the bad guy, purple guy, his original business partner is the one who kind of orchestrates all of the games and then makes it so that they all meet here, and then he's going to burn them all down to release all of the souls from all the haunted animatronics or whatever. And at the end of that game, when he does it, he says, for one of you, the darkest pit of hell has opened to swallow you whole. So don't keep the devil waiting, old friend.
That's hard as hell.
And the fact that he says that in FNAF 6 Pizzeria Simulator
is crazy.
It's so crazy, but it's so like awesome. It's such an awesome quote. Because FNAF like doesn't really have like dialogue, I guess.
Yeah, it's like pretty much a text-based affair.
Yeah,
right?
You get like the phone calls, I guess, but like that's it. Another one in this vein I have is from the show It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, which is like my favorite show. And one of the characters, Dennis, says, "I've known beggars to be kings and kings to be beggars, all because they believed it so."
It's Always Sunny.
Yeah, because he's basically, when this happens, he's in like a sensory deprivation tank, and it's his subconscious talking to him, and he says it, and he says that to him. And then he proceeds to I don't even want to say it. He proceeds to basically force his subconscious.
We can cut this out.
Inside the sensory deprivation tank.
That's crazy. I was thinking time is a flat circle from True Detective has just permeated into that's stuff people say.
I didn't even know that was from True Detective.
Me neither. I said it, and here's a story. I said that in senior year of honors English. I said time is a flat circle. I thought it was just an expression, and then my teacher was like, "Oh, you watch True Detective?" I'm like, "No." And then after class, she was like, "You should watch True Detective." She lent me her DVDs.
She gave you the True Detective,
a box set of
True Detective on DVD.
I gave it back, but I was like,
wait, how old did you say you were when this happened?
I mean, I was in high school. I was in senior year honors English.
That's so fun.
I know. She's super cool. Shout out to
Mrs. Coombs. I love that she had.
Yeah, it's very funny. Great show.
I heard it's a great show.
It's very fun. It's like inappropriate. You know what I mean? It's like, that's a show with amazing dialogue. I think it's like Matthew McConaughey and Woody Harrelson's characters, they're just so like, they are kind of like an odd couple, kind of like kind of X-Files like investigation team where it's like, well, one person is a little more out there, the other's a little more grounded, a very Mulder and Scully kind of situation. But like, I love this is a great gag in True Detective when Matthew McConaughey is his character. He's just kind of going off, and he's just kind of like, I don't think humans should reproduce, or I think we suck and we're killing the earth, whatever. And then he just starts saying shit. It's really funny. He goes, "You can smell the psychosphere," or whatever.
What?
I'm like, what are you talking? What is Blood Waffling about?
I love that.
And then later, Woody Harrelson's character goes, "I need you to stop saying weird shit." And he literally says, like, "You can smell a psychosphere."
I can hear Woody Harrelson saying that, bro.
It's great. Like, dialogue like that is really funny. I think something like Breaking Bad has amazing dialogue.
Oh yeah.
Not just in the like the serious stuff, the humor.
Oh, Breaking Bad is
It's a comedy.
It's one of the most like understated comedic shows like ever. Like there's so much comedy in that show.
Wire.
Yeah. like Bryan Cranston is such a funny actor, and like the fact that he played like one of the most dramatic, like serious roles like of all time.
Yeah,
it's so funny.
You know what's funny? I'm an X-Files fan. I'm watching like season 6, and like that's another X-Files is like, I don't know if X-Files is good. But I just know I've watched 6 seasons of it.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
I just don't know if it's like, I think there's some episodes where I'm like, this is good. And then there's some episodes where I'm just like, the dialogue, especially when, okay, in the X-Files, there's only really 2 characters. And it's the main duo, Mulder and Scully. And, they have their tics and they have their, standard kind of modus operandi when it comes to their dialogue and how they speak. You want to talk about autopilot dialogue. It's just like sometimes a plot just for an X-Files episode just has to happen. And they can't really think of a creative or clever reason why any of these 2 characters would care. Or like, sometimes it's not super tied in well with who these characters are. And like that's not great. There's multiple episodes where Mulder gets body swapped with some other guy, or like there's an episode where someone's pretending to be Mulder, and like the dialogue in that is really important because
it's like hinting at it to the other characters.
It's like, okay, would Mulder say this? Would Mulder do this? No. But the characters can't really fathom the idea that he's been body snatched, so they kind of have to just deal with it. It's like, why is Mulder like smoking cigars in the office?
Why is he being really weird today?
Yeah, like why? We're just having an off day. Like he's been body snatched, and that's the whole plot of the episode. But and that X-Files is another kind of underrated comedy where like most of the time they're trying to do something dramatic, and they're leaning into a horror angle, or they're leaning into a noirish kind of thing. Noir, I think, has
that's one of the things I wrote down is just. I didn't even like elaborate on it. I just put film noir because I think it just has the best dialogue out of like any genre.
Yeah,
I love it.
I love it as well. Like when they're just like no one talks like that anymore, so it's like so refreshing.
Snappy. It's so snappy is the thing.
Like I think it's because I guess when it comes down to it, most characters in like film noir are adults.
Yeah,
they're like mature people,
and most of them are kind of assholes.
Low-key,
yeah, like actually.
Yeah, like most of them are pretty bad people.
Yeah, like except for the detective usually.
That's pretty much like what noir's all about.
Yeah, it's
like,
supposed to be.
This like, one guy's really cool. The rest of the world is not.
Yeah, he's like the white knight in a world of darkness.
Yeah, and like I love. There's a crime literature class here at Rowan.
I took that last semester.
It's really cool. Yeah, I took it like my first semester. Yeah, and like reading like The Big Sleep. Yeah. I know like no one in that class except for a couple other people like read the book. I read it cover to cover. I'm like, this is kind of gas. I don't know. Like, I love the noir dialogue is great. I think cowboy movies and stuff like something like Red Dead Redemption and these kind of like modern kind of cowboy. Yeah, like westerns always have great dialogue, and you can kind of see when genre fiction, like sci-fi, like the space western or like the space noir, like they like Star Wars is kind of leaning into that spaghetti western thing. Like people went gaga over the Mandalorian because it's basically just reusing cowboy stuff. Yeah, it's reusing samurai stuff. Yeah. Like it's like I can bring you in warm or I can bring you in cold. If you told me like, okay, what is this line from? I'd probably say like a western.
Yeah, or some type of like bounty hunter thing,
or maybe a film noir where it's like
police drama or something.
Yeah, like but then it's actually from the Mandalorian, which is like, okay, I don't know if the 3 pillars are not absolute. There's certainly an exception to rule 2 or rule rule 2 with the isolation thing, where it's like
if you said who said this
in Star Wars,
you would probably say, oh, like the Mandalorian or like Boba Fett or like maybe like that's it pretty much.
IG-88 boss,
famous bounty hunter IG-88
or Dengar. Glup Shido. So I feel like we're actually winding down now.
Yeah.
So I don't think I have anything more to say about dialogue, other than reinterpreting my 3 points.
Yeah. I think like my thoughts have been encapsulated.
Yeah, and so basically, I guess if we want to end on one little word of not writing advice. It's not writing advice, but just keep these things in mind. I think when you're writing dialogue, and I think it can be tough if you're like a poet who's kind of transitioning into prose, or even vice versa, where maybe you're getting back into it. Yeah. If you haven't written in a long time, or if you're a little rusty, it can definitely feel like you got to shake off the rust, and it's like, okay, thinking a little deeper about what your characters are doing and saying is a reward in and of itself. You're always going to be rewarded for thinking a little deeper about what you're doing. So that concludes our inaugural episode of All Killer, No Filler. On campus, we have meetings every Wednesday from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. in 260 Victoria, room 301. I would like to remind you all that we are an Avant podcast.
We are affiliated with Rowan Avant Literary Magazine.
That's right. On campus, we have meetings every Wednesday, 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. in 260 Victoria Street, room 301. That is where we actually, read pieces that you, the students of Avant, submit.
The students of Rowan University. And you can follow us on Twitter at RUAvant and on Instagram at Rowan Avant and on Facebook at Avant Literary Magazine. And you can find All Killer, No Filler on rowanavant.com or Avant's YouTube channel, as well as Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
At this present moment, we don't quite know exactly the future of this program.
We'll find a home.
Yeah. We'll find a home at some point. We do want it to be on, places where people listen to podcasts.
Yeah.
I think, Spotify and Apple, those are the big ones. I'm a Spotify. I don't pay for premium, I'm sorry. But
I'm a Spotify guy.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm a Spotify guy. But anyway, we are signing off. We'll see you in the next one.